In this video, we're going to start to break apart a workflow. So what I'm going to do is describe the process of what we need to do in order to create a workflow within the orchestrator. And then we'll step you through the steps that we took in order to create this. So in this particular workflow, we're going to create a WordPress instance. And this instance is going to be split across actually two different clouds. So you can see in this particular scenario, we have Gcloud, which has a container engine, and in AWS, there's RDS. So what we want to do is create a WordPress instance, and WordPress, is a blogging platform that contains basically a web server and it connects to a database. So in order for this to work, we need to first have a container engine to connect to and Amazon RDS to connect to, and then we need to use some atomic actions to interact with those things. So first thing first, we have a few atomic actions that aren't there already. So create RDS instance isn't something that came out of the box in the orchestrator. Query RDS instance isn't something that came out of the box, and neither is delete. Now, delete's kind of optional. That I really used when I was messing around with this to try and figure out, to create a database and then delete a database. It's not really needed for this, but it's nice to have. So the process to create something in GKE is that we're going to create WordPress using Helm with parameters that connect to an external DB. So when you use Helm, there are these parameters that allow us to modify the standard configuration. So that's what we're going to do to create GKE. But first, before we even use the GKE process with Helm in order to create the DB, we need an RDS instance, because you need an RDS instance first, because you can see here that the container is going to connect to the RDS instance. So in order for that to happen, when this is being installed, we need to have this RDS instance there. So once we have that, or in order to have that, we need to create the RDS instance. Then we're going to need to query the RDS instance to see if it's created before we do anything else, because you don't want to continue on with this flow because this wouldn't be in existence first and this would just give you errors. So we're going to need to query that RDS instance to see if it's created. And then we're going to need to create a database within that RDS instance. And then optionally, and I actually say optionally because I already have a security group for databases, so I don't really need this, but you would create the security group for connectivity from GKE to RDS. So that's what we're going to do. And let's take a look and walk through the actual workflow to see what we did. So we talked about the fact that we needed to create a DB instance. Now there's a bunch of stuff here on the AWS side, but create DB instance wasn't one of them. So you can see this has three little folders here, which denotes that it's an atomic action that we've created. And if I go into there, this is a very simple one. So I'm going to edit this atomic action and you'll see what the create DB instance is. So the create DB instance, all it is a bunch of, is an actual call to AWS using this RDS URL with a bunch of different parameters here. Now what we've done is we've created variables that will be populated within the workflow. Now this is an atomic action. So when you use an atomic action, and you create variables, they're shown to the workflow, not to the end user. If you want to pass those to the end user, then you create some other input variables on the workflow. So what you'll see here is that we have a DB name, we have a master password, and we have a master username. So basically DB, the username and password. That's all you need in here in order to create the DB instance. And you can see we added those variables right here. Here is a workflow input master password, and that is mapped to the MySQL master user password. We have the create DB instance DB name that is mapped to the DB2 T2 micro DB instance identifier. Sorry, just the DB instance T2 identifier. And then we also have the username, master username, which is mapped to master username. Now, how did we get that? So if I went to create DB instance, and this is AWS's documentation around RDS, you'll see that it tells you exactly what you need here. So here's an example. If you want the information about what each one of these do, then you can come up here and take a look, and it'll tell you what each one of these different parameters do. But the easiest way is just on the right-hand side, it says example, and you could kind of pretty easily tell what each one of these things do. So really the only thing that we wanted to specify was the DB instance identifier, the password, and the username. All this other stuff we really, we really don't need to specify because it's kind of, we assume certain things. Now you may want to do instance class to decide what size you want. In this particular instance, I didn't. The other thing to note here is that it has a lot of stuff with signatures, but the orchestrator actually takes care of all of this signature stuff. So one of the things that we should look at is when we actually did this AWS service, you could see this says generic AWS API request. So we're not creating an atomic action on an HTTP REST. We're actually taking the low-level adapter, which is AWS API request, which means that it already understands how to use those signatures and talk to AWS. If we did it using REST, we would have to do all those signatures and things like that. Another thing to note is that AWS API is a little bit different than some of the other APIs. It's not cruddy, meaning that you have that, that you post and you get and all that kind of stuff. It can either use get or post to create any of their interactions, which is kind of unique with AWS. So again, very simply, all we're doing is making this call. It's a get, and we're putting in some parameters here. Now, if we look back at this create DB instance, what you'll notice is these are those input parameters from the atomic action that we put through here. Now, the other thing to note is that if I click on the open area here, not on any of the actions, you'll see that I have a bunch of variables here. Now, these variables are what actually are going to be prompted to the user. Now, even though this create DB instance had some variables in its atomic action, we still need to map those variables to something that we want. So these variables were prompted to the workflow input variables for DB name and for DB username and DB password. And that way, when the workflow runs, it's going to fill in the atomic action variables right here. So that is the create DB instance. This one's going to actually go and it's going to create a DB instance within RDS. Now this whole loop right here, from there to there, is a loop that will just check to see if the RDS instance is available yet. Now, one of the things you'll see, and I forget whether it shows you in here, but I think it does, is there is a status here, DB instance status. And it actually says creating here. It says some other status items, but when the status is complete, when I query DB host here, when I get DB status here, it's going to say that the DB instance status, it just gets it there. But when it says the DB instance status is created, then it will actually assign another variable. But created is the word we're looking for. So let's loop through this. So we have a loop. This is a while loop. So it basically continues until, and we'll look at the next one, break when created var equals true. So we created a variable here that's a Boolean. And let's go, I'm just clicking on the open part here. And I created one that's called created. It's a Boolean, and it's set to false by default. And the reason why I did that is because I want to set something to true based on a value. So this will break when created, that variable we set, equals true. So what we do is we get the RDS status, which is the actual call. And again, this is another atomic action that I created. And this one, we use describe DB instances. And you'll see all we do is put in the region that we want. So the region the DB instance is in. And this will actually get all RDS instances. Then what I do is actually convert the XML to JSON, because JSON is a lot easier to parse within this orchestrator. And then I set an output variable that I'm setting called RDS instances, because when you create an atomic action like this, you need to create an output variable to use within the next step. So I create it, and it actually is the conversion of the XML to JSON that's going to be mapped to that from the describe RDS instances. So that's all we do here. Again, this describe DBS instances is right here. And if you go to an example, you can see it. And all we do is we take that and we basically just copy it down to here with whatever variables you need to insert. So, so one of the things that we do here is we also pass that variable over here. So you can see that I'm using US East 2 here. So I populated that right in here, hard-coded. I could have also passed that through to an input variable, but we didn't need to in this instance. So in the next step, what you can see, this is a JSON path query. So I'm just trying to get one particular variable from that RDS info. And what I know from looking at it, from running it, even before this, so let's say all this stuff wasn't here. All I'm doing is get this RDS info, and I'm getting a snippet of it to see what value I needed. And in JSON path, which is kind of a little outside of the scope here, it's the piece that I need is starting at the root, describe DB instances response, describe DB instances result, DB instances, DB instance, and DB instance status. And I'm going to call this DB instance status, and it's going to be a string. So what this is going to do is just get that DB instance status from here. Then I'm using this check DB available. Is it available? And what this is doing in this piece is doing a condition block. And basically, if the activity get DB status output JSON path query is equals available, then I'm going to query the DB host to get the address, because we're going to need the address within the next step of Helm in order to map to that address. So this is what actually gets the IP address of the or name of the DB instance. So once it's created, it's going to get that address. And then what I do is I set the created flag. And what we talked about before up here is that it's going to loop until it says created. So it keeps looping, looping, looping. And finally, when it's created, and by the way, this whole loop has a sleep in it, so I'm not continually querying that get RDS info like every second. So I put a sleep for about 5 seconds in here, so it keeps going, 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 but it'll sleep 5 seconds because you just don't want to pound on that API. And then after that's done, I'm making a request here that is just a MySQL request or a post, or actually it's a command line, sorry. MySQL command line that is create database. And you notice that all this stuff is filled in from the input variables. So whether it's the name, the database, the whatever it is that we need, it's all getting filled in from the input variables. So we only prompt the user once for that, and it's used in multiple parts within this workflow. And the last part here is that we're actually using Helm to create that WordPress instance, and we're setting a lot of variables here. The WordPress password, we're setting that MariaDB is used, and here's the external host, and we got the address here from when that address was created, and we got the username, password, and name. So all this stuff was received from previous inputs or from getting the database. The other thing that you want to note here is that I'm using something called a cloud box, and I created this cloud box, and all it is a Kubernetes instance that I run all my tools on. So I have things like MySQL and Terraform and Helm and all these other kinds of things on there so that I can just SSH to this box and run commands that I want. So there's a couple ways I could have done this. This is the easy way to do it. I could have also made a REST API request to do some of this stuff, but a lot of times it's just easier to create these kinds of interactions and just do it this way. So all I do is I have a jump box basically that I use for all of my interactions to all my different hosts. And in my case, I use Kubernetes pod to do that, but you could also use a VM or something like that. So if we run this, what you'll see is that all it does is it prompts for the username, the password, the DB name, the DB username, DB password. And that's all it does. And once I hit run, it's going to create all of that. So if I view runs here, and I'll view for year to date, you'll see that it did all that. It created all those steps, and it did all those things, and then it created WordPress. So that's how we do it. It's a very, this is the first walkthrough of many that we're going to do, but this is just a good example of how you use a workflow to create a complete end-to-end type of interaction with the orchestrator. At the end here, what we'll see is WordPress installed. So this is the final result. Thanks for watching.